all drugs should be illegal. Now, normally when I get a comment like this, it's either because they're dumb or they're heartless. But in this case, they are 16 years old. And that makes it easy for me to be sympathetic. Because personally, I hope that nothing I said before the age of 25 will ever come to light again. People can change. And hell, I changed on this issue. I grew up in the church, and all the adults I knew said drugs were bad. And even as I first started taking them, I still thought that. But then, drugs became my special interest, because they sit at the intersection of my background as a biochemist and as a writer who is curious about people. Now, from the vantage point I have, I would go back to my young self, and I would start with the explanation that would have made the most sense to me at the time. The war on drugs was birthed in racism and fed and fattened on racism. When you look at prohibitions against drugs throughout history, it's often said that they're implemented to protect public health or morality. But really, drug laws are usually a tool of control to be used against those people and their drugs. I'll focus right now in the US just because it's where the modern war on drugs was mostly birthed and then exported via the UN into the rest of the world. The first anti-narcotic law in the US was in 1875 in San Francisco for opium. It passed after an anti-opium campaign against the Chinese. You couldn't make being Chinese illegal, but you could make the drug used by some of them illegal. One of the reasons behind the anti-opium campaign was white people were beginning to learn about opium smoking at these opium dens. And even worse, the opium dens were beginning to be associated with sexual relations between the races. Once that anti-opium law passed, the enforcement was greatest against those opium dens that allowed in white people. As the academic William White states it, and I quote, "The public came to recognize two addicts, one a victim and the other a villain. The former's addiction was considered accidental, harmless, and deserving of pity. The latter's addiction was considered voluntary, dangerous, and a source of fear. Addiction in the former was a disease. Addiction in the latter was a vice. The former was white. The latter was Chinese." End quote. Then, for cannabis. The first municipal ban by a town was in El Paso, Texas in 1915, right on the border. For all of the unwanted Mexican immigrants who were fleeing the Mexican Revolution, banning their marijuana made them easier to arrest. The newspapers at the time carried graphic stories of the drug causing a lust for blood and superhuman strength. As Latinos moved farther north following the so-called sugar beet trail and finding work in the sugar beet fields of Colorado and Wyoming and Nebraska, cannabis bans followed them. Newspapers talked of loco weed that would make them become crazed and violent. This became a justification for increased police surveillance at the immigrant labor camps. And, moving further in history, that crazed violence was a huge part of the story with cocaine. As jazz was being birthed in New Orleans at the beginning of the 1900s, not only did cannabis become associated with the scene, as well as increased sexual relations between the races, cocaine also got that reputation for violence. Cocaine was seen as a drug that charged black men with superhuman violence who were, according to this famous article from the time, impervious to .32 caliber bullets. This resulted in local law enforcement across the South to switch to heavier pistols. One of our first examples of the war on drugs increasing police force. Stories like these led to the 1914 Harrison Act, which was the first federal U.S. law to make certain drugs only available by prescription, specifically cocaine and opiates. And then, for the next 50 years, these laws against drugs would be used more often against people of color, and the coverage of them in the media often deeply racist in the same manner as William White talked about in San Francisco 150 years ago. White people with an illness and people of color with a vice. Who made it more political? Richard Milhous Nixon, a man so crooked but so intelligent that any student of U.S. history with a fondness for con men and Machiavellian politics has to respect them. Nixon had a problem with the youth counterculture. They opposed his war in Vietnam, and they were making him look bad. So what did he do? 30 years after the fact, his drug czar, John Ehrlichman, laid it out plainly in an interview to my beloved drug journalist Dan Baum. And I'll paraphrase this slightly. The Nixon campaign in 1968 had two enemies, the anti-war left and the black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. End quote. And did they go on to do that? They sure as shit did. In their campaign of harassment and assassinations against the Black Panthers, drugs were often used as a tool to put unwanted political activists in prison. And they did do the same thing against the white counterculture, but frankly, as someone who's read a lot of the history, the level of enforcement against white people wasn't even in the same ballpark. Then, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan came in and supercharged the war on drugs, instituting a system of mandatory minimums that led to a flood of men of color into the prison system. And ever since then, every president has increased enforcement of the war on drugs. Some have done more, some have done less, but no Democrat or Republican has made things better. And so, when talking to my young self all those years ago, who already had a decent knowledge of the dark ways of the world, I would say the illegalization of drugs was always more about politics and control than public health and safety. Making drugs illegal means making people illegal. Can you imagine if we tried an outright ban on tobacco cigarettes right now? There is already a decent black market from the Native American reservations, and that's only to escape a heavy tax rate. If there were enforcement officers searching for tobacco products, their prices would skyrocket. The adulterants and public safety would be atrocious, and little old ladies would get used to dealing with the black market and start slipping into other drugs, which is a real phenomenon that happens with prohibition. And of course, all the money would flow to illegal networks of criminals, and the people who got busted would be poor folks at the bottom of the ladder who are running product or growing illegal plants. The kingpins would still be making their money. And the police would still be having fun going on raids that didn't really stop the problem. And the politicians and the customs officers who were getting greased for looking the other way wouldn't mind. The people who would suffer would be the poor souls who really needed a fix of tobacco, and the other poor souls who would risk getting busted for the extra profit of getting it to them. So no, I don't think any drug should be illegal. If you want to talk to me about something like the late Mark Kleinman's begrudging toleration, where we allow fairly harmful drugs like alcohol and tobacco into our system, but we tax them heavily to make them less attractive to people, I could see that. But after 20 years of looking at this stuff, one of the only things I can firmly say is that I believe in harm reduction. I believe in needle exchanges and safer supply programs and supervised injection facilities. I believe in options that help keep people alive and allow them to do less harm to themselves rather than more harm, no matter what the substance it is that they take.